She was 22 and disinherited. No dowry, no title, no share of the great gray house she had grown up inside. Only a servant's token wrapped in brown paper and a small silver locket she kept in the seam of her pocket. And when the sealed half of her father's will was at last unfolded upon the solicitor's desk, it revealed something the family had entirely failed to imagine, something quietly and precisely arranged years before his death, something that would change the shape of Mary Weaver's life forever. So settle in and let us know from which lane, town, or country you are listening tonight. And stay close, because this is the story of Ash Creek, and of a father who was, in the end, neither cruel nor careless, only careful in a way no one who mattered had bothered to see. Mary Weaver had been born in the spring of 1848 in a stone farmhouse on the eastern slope of Ash Creek, a scattered parish of some 40 households set between the low hills and the slow brown water that gave the place its name. And she was the only child of Thomas Weaver, a grazier and wool merchant of moderate holdings, and his first wife, Anne, who died of a fever when Mary was 4. Anne Weaver had been remembered in the village as a small, brown-haired woman who sang while she worked, and who had brought with her, upon her marriage, a modest oval locket of chased silver holding a lock of her own mother's hair, which she gave to Mary on the last afternoon they sat together in the parlor, pressing it into the child's palm and closing the fingers around it, as though sealing a promise. Mary had kept the locket ever since, first strung on a bit of ribbon under her pinafore, and later, when she was older, in a small inner pocket she had stitched herself into every dress she owned, and she touched it in the same absent way another girl might touch a rosary or a wedding ring. Her father, Thomas, was a man of long silences and long ledgers, and after Anne's death, he ran the household and the flocks with the same patient exactness, until, 3 years later, he married a widow from the neighboring parish named Judith Marlowe, who brought with her 2 sons, Edwin and Peter, and a firm conviction that a household required a mistress with plain views on the ordering of children. Mary was moved from the room that had been her mother's sewing room into a smaller chamber above the scullery, and though she was never mistreated in any way a village gossip could name, she was gradually and thoroughly moved to the outer edge of her own family, taking her meals at the corner of the long table, and her lessons alone with whatever book her father set beside her plate. What saved her, in the way that saving so often happens in quiet houses, was the presence of the household's cook and general keeper, a widow named Hannah Sowerby, who had come into Thomas Weaver's employment at the age of 42 the year Anne died, and who was still there, gray-haired and stiff-shouldered. When Mary was old enough to stand on a stool at the kitchen table and hold a rolling pin, Hannah had lost her own husband and infant son to the same fever that had taken Anne, and she said very little about it and a great deal about pastry, and she taught Mary the whole slow language of a working kitchen. How to render lard clean, how to salt a ham, how to set a milk pan so the cream rose true, how to steep chamomile for a headache and yarrow for a cut, how to keep a household book in a neat column of pence and shillings so that no farthing walked off unaccounted. She taught her to mend a torn hem so the stitch could not be found, to darn a stocking heel over an egg-shaped darning ball of turned beech, to lay a coal fire that would hold through the small hours of a winter morning, and to speak civilly to a butcher who thought he could pass off yesterday's mutton to a girl. Mary was quick and she was patient, and by the time she was 16, she could keep the Weaver books better than her stepmother and cook a Sunday dinner for 8 without hurry. And Hannah, watching her from the doorway with her arms folded and her mouth soft in a way that never showed itself in company, told her once, and only once, that a woman who knew how to work would never in her life be truly poor. Mary remembered the sentence the way she remembered the weight of the locket, and she carried both of them into every room of the years that followed. Thomas Weaver died in the second week of February 1870, of a chill that settled into his chest after a night out with a lame ewe, and he was buried in the parish churchyard on a gray Tuesday, with the ground still hard enough to ring under the sexton's spade. The will was read 3 days later in the front parlor of Mr. Bramwell, solicitor of Ash Creek, a narrow man with narrow spectacles who spoke as though every sentence cost him a penny he did not wish to spend. Judith sat in the good chair with Edwin and Peter, now 24 and 21, arranged behind her like a pair of well-tailored fence posts, and Mary sat on the small hard chair by the window with her gloved hands folded and the locket a familiar shape against her hip. Hannah Sowerby was not in the room. Hannah had been asked to wait in the kitchen with the other servants, because it was understood by all present that the reading of a gentleman's will was not the business of the woman who had baked his bread. Mr. Bramwell unfolded the first document with a dry crackle, and he read the outer will in a voice that made no distinction between a shilling and a soul. To his wife, Judith Weaver, formerly Marlowe, he left the house on the eastern slope and its contents and the greater portion of the flocks and the yearly income therefrom. To his stepsons, Edwin and Peter Marlowe, he left equal shares in the wool trade and the ledgers of the merchant house. To his daughter, Mary Weaver, he left, and here Mr. Bramwell paused only long enough to turn the page, the sum of £5 and a keepsake to be selected from the household linens, being the customary provision made for a servant of long service in a respectable house. There was a small silence in the parlor, and Judith did not look at Mary, and Edwin examined a spot on the carpet, and Peter permitted himself the faintest movement of the corner of his mouth. Mary did not speak. She folded her hands a little tighter, and she watched the winter light move across the brass fender, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, of the way Hannah had taught her to set a milk pan. Mr. Bramwell coughed once, and asked whether the family required a moment, and Judith said, in the voice she used with tradesmen, that they did not, and that the girl might collect her £5 at the office on the following Monday, and that a linen sheet from the second press would suit for the keepsake. Mary rose then, and thanked Mr. Bramwell for his time in the level voice Hannah had taught her to use with butchers, and she walked out of the parlor, and down the hall, and up the narrow back stair to the chamber above the scullery, where her small trunk stood already half-packed, because a woman who knew how to work also knew how to read the weather in a house. She folded her 3 dresses, her 2 shifts, her Sunday shawl, her Bible, her mother's hymn book, her darning ball of turned beech, her small tin of chamomile, and her household book with its columns of pence and shillings. And she laid Anne's locket in the inner pocket she had stitched into her traveling dress, and she closed the trunk and sat on it and waited for morning. She left the house at first light on the Wednesday, with the £5 in a knotted handkerchief and the folded sheet from the second press wrapped in brown paper under her arm, and Hannah standing in the yard in her grey shawl watching her go. Hannah did not embrace her because Hannah did not embrace, but she pressed into Mary's hand a slip of paper folded twice and told her, in a voice pitched low against the frost, to go to the address written on it and to ask no questions of anyone on the road. The carter who took her as far as the crossroads at Netherbridge was a man named Job Ackley, who charged her a shilling and gave her back 6pence when he saw her face, and from Netherbridge she walked. The lane out of the village ran between hedgerows of blackthorn still bare and beaded with the night's rime, and the fields on either hand lay grey under a low grey sky, and the rooks went up in ragged clouds from the ploughland as she passed. She walked with her trunk on a small handcart borrowed against the promise of return, and the wheels caught in the ruts and had to be lifted, and by the second mile her gloves were wet through and her boots were heavy with the clay of the lane. She passed a shepherd on a stile who nodded to her without speaking, and a woman drawing water at a pump who watched her with the flat curiosity of a village, and a boy driving 3 geese who called out a greeting she did not quite hear. The country beyond Ash Creek was country she had never walked, though she had seen it named on the coach map her father kept in the hall. The parish of Little Denby, 4 miles to the southwest, a hollow of pasture and coppice threaded by a nameless brook that ran into the Ash further down. She had eaten a slice of bread and cheese at 7, and she did not stop to eat again, because the light was thin and the sky was already lowering to a colder gray, and because she did not trust herself to sit down. She read Hannah's slip once at the milestone where the lane forked, and the handwriting was Hannah's, careful and square, and it named a cottage called Hollowstone at the end of a track past the Denby smithy, and it named a key hidden under the 3rd stone of the doorstep, and it said in the last line that the place was hers now if she could bear it. Mary folded the paper back into her glove, and she took the left-hand fork, and she walked on into the wind that had begun to come up off the ridge, carrying the smell of coal smoke from cottages she could not yet see. The smithy at Little Denby stood at a bend in the lane with a red door and a black anvil set out under a lean-to, and Mary passed it without stopping and turned onto the track it marked. The track was narrower than the lane and rutted deeper, and hazel grew close on either side with the last of the year's brown leaves clinging in the hedge. At the end of the track, set a little back from a low stone wall, stood the cottage called Hollowstone. It was small. It was a 2-room cottage of coursed gray stone under a roof of thin slate, with a single chimney at the western gable, and a lean-to at the eastern gable that had once been a wash-house, and was now more or less a pile of leaning boards. The front door was of oak planks, bound with 2 iron straps and studded with square nails, and the wood had gone silver from weather, and the lower edge had rotted where the rain came off the step. There were 2 windows on the front, each of 4 small panes in a leaded frame, and one of the panes was cracked across, and another was gone altogether and had been stuffed with a wad of sacking. The doorstep was a single slab of gray sandstone worn into a shallow dish in the middle from years of feet, and set into the ground before it were 3 flat cobbles laid as a path. Mary set down the handles of the handcart and knelt and lifted the 3rd cobble with her fingers. Beneath it, in a small hollow lined with clay, lay a heavy iron key wrapped in a scrap of oiled cloth. The key turned in the lock with effort and a dry sound, and the door opened inward on hinges that had not been oiled in a long time. Inside was 1 room across the front, some 12 feet by 15, with a flagged floor and a wide hearth of rough stone. A crane hung in the hearth with a pot-hook still on it. Above the hearth was a mantel of oak split down its length. Under the front window stood a settle with the seat lifted off its pegs and leaning against the wall. Against the back wall stood a dresser of dark wood with 3 shelves, and on the shelves were 4 plates, 2 mugs, and a chipped brown jug. A ladder in the corner led up through a square hole to a small loft under the slates. Behind the front room, through a plank door, was a scullery of about 8 feet by 10, with a shallow stone sink drained out through the wall, a copper set into brickwork, and shelves for crocks. Everything smelled of cold stone and old smoke, and the mildew that comes into a place when no fire has been lit in it for a year. The ceiling was low and beamed with rough oak, and the beams were sound. 2 of the slates had slipped on the north pitch, and a patch of the ceiling plaster had come down onto the flags. The lime wash on the walls had gone yellow and was flaking at the corners. The dresser was solid. The settle would go back on its pegs with an hour's work. There was a broom leaning behind the door, its besom worn to a stump. There was a rush candle in a pewter holder on the mantel with half an inch of tallow yet to burn. Mary stood in the middle of the flagged floor with her gloves in her hand, and she looked at the room slowly, corner to corner, the way Hannah had taught her to look at a kitchen before starting work in it. Then she went back to the door and dragged her trunk over the sill and set it down beside the hearth, and she began. She swept the flags with the worn besom, and she carried the fallen plaster out and tipped it against the wall of the lean-to. She wiped the dresser shelves with a rag torn from the folded sheet Judith had allowed her from the second press. She laid a small fire in the hearth, with kindling from a bundle she found in a corner of the scullery, dry and years old but still willing to catch, and she struck a light from a tinderbox on the mantel that held one scrap of charcloth and a good flint. The fire took, and a thin, pale smoke went up the chimney, and after a moment the chimney drew clean. It was while she was on her knees at the hearth, feeding small sticks to the flame, that Mary noticed the hearthstone was not one stone but two. The larger slab lay across the front of the fire, and behind it, tight against the back wall of the fireplace under a coat of soot, was a second stone about a foot square, set flush and mortared at three edges. The mortar on the fourth edge had crumbled away, and a fine dark line showed where a knife had once been slid in. Mary sat back on her heels and looked at it. Then she rose and fetched the poker from the settle and worked the point of it into the line. The stone was heavy, but it moved. She eased it out with both hands and set it on the flags beside her, and she looked into the cavity behind. Inside was a tin box, the size of a Bible, painted black once and now flaked, with a small brass hasp. Behind the box, laid flat against the back of the cavity, was a folded paper tied with a length of blue thread. Mary lifted them both out. Her hands were sooty and she wiped them on her apron before she opened the box. The box held a small cloth bag of coins and a bundle of banknotes folded together. Mary counted them on the flags in the firelight. There were 42 sovereigns in the bag, heavy and bright, and there were banknotes for a further £60. It was more money than Mary Weaver had ever held in her life. She set the coins back in the bag and set the bag back in the box, and she took up the folded paper. The thread came apart at a touch. Inside was a single sheet of good paper, close written in a small, careful hand in brown ink that had faded evenly with the years, and at the head of the sheet was written a date, the 14th of June, 1841, and a name. Elizabeth Fenn, widow of Hollowstone Cottage, Little Denby. Mary read the first line and stopped and looked up at the fire and then back at the page. Elizabeth Fenn had been her mother's mother. The lock of hair in the locket at Mary's hip had been cut from this woman's head. Mary Weaver had never met her, and had known her only as a name spoken once or twice by her mother in the parlor. And now she sat in the woman's cottage on the woman's flagged floor with the woman's savings in a tin box at her knee and the woman's letter in her hand. Mary read the letter through twice and then folded it and set it on the mantel under the pewter candle holder where it would be safe from ash. She did not weep. She banked the fire, set the tin box in the trunk under her folded shifts, and slept that first night wrapped in the shawl on the settle she had put back on its pegs. With the poker within reach and the door bolted with a length of oak she cut from the leaning boards of the wash-house. At first light, she began the work in the order Hannah would have set it. Shelter first, water second, food third, and only then the finer repairs. She walked back to the smithy at the bend in the lane and spoke to the smith, a broad man of about 50 named Rowland Peake, who had been at his forge since he was 12 and knew every roof and gate in the parish. She showed him the 2 slipped slates on the north pitch and asked what a man would charge to set them. Rowland Peake looked at her and at Hollowstone standing behind her and said his boy Thomas would come with a ladder on Thursday and set them for 2 shillings and a loaf if she could spare one. Mary said she could and would. And on Wednesday, she walked into Little Denby Village and spent one of Elizabeth Fenn's sovereigns at the grocer's counter, kept by a small, sharp woman named Mrs. Ada Fewster, age 61, widowed of a lay clerk. Mrs. Fewster weighed out flour, oatmeal, salt, sugar in a blue paper, tea in a twist of brown, a pound of lard, half a pound of bacon, and a cake of yellow soap. And she gave the change and a look that took in Mary's boots and her clean cuffs and her steady hand on the purse. Mrs. Fewster asked no questions. She told Mary the well at Hollowstone was good water, and that the pump handle had wanted a new leather since 1868, and that Job Hoggart the cooper would cut her one for 3d. By Thursday afternoon, Thomas Peake, aged 19, had set the slates with fresh copper nails and pointed them in with lime mortar mixed on a board on the doorstep, and Mary had baked him the loaf in the copper set into the scullery brickwork, having lit a first small fire beneath it with cut hazel from the hedge. The loaf came out dense and pale and honest, and Thomas Peake ate half of it on the walk home and told his father the cottage was drying already. Mary set the rooms in a sequence. She lime-washed the front room herself with a bucket of slaked lime she bought from a builder passing through with a cart, brushed on with a worn stock brush in even strokes across the ceiling first and down the walls after, 3 coats laid 2 days apart. She scrubbed the flags with sand and hot water and lye until the gray stone showed its own quiet color. She oiled the dresser with linseed rubbed in with a wool rag and buffed it dry. She mended the split oak mantel with 2 iron straps forged for her by Rowland Peake at a shilling the pair and set flush into notches cut with a chisel borrowed from him. She reglazed the cracked pane with a small square of glass from a broken pantry window at the vicarage that the vicar's wife, Mrs. Harriet Bligh, aged 44, gave her for nothing when Mary called with a jar of chamomile for the vicar's headaches. The scullery she took last. She scoured the sink with river sand and set a new leather in the pump. She whitewashed the copper's brickwork and swept out a jackdaw's nest from the flue. She hung the darning ball of turned beech and Anne's hymn book on the shelf above the settle, and she put the household book with its columns of pence and shillings on the dresser where the light from the front window fell across it in the afternoons. She entered every farthing spent. 2 shillings to the Peakes, 3d to Job Hoggart, 11d 3 farthings to Mrs. Fewster on the second week, 6d for a bundle of tallow candles, a shilling to a boy who cut and stacked her a rick of hazel and blackthorn for the fire. By the end of the 3rd week, Hollowstone stood clean and quiet under a sound roof, with a fire that drew properly and a door that closed on oiled hinges, and Mary Weaver had spent £7 and 8 shillings and had £94 and change still folded in the tin box behind the hearthstone, where she had put it back without hesitation. Word traveled in Little Denby as it travels in any small parish. Mrs. Fewster spoke of the young woman at Hollowstone who paid in full and asked the price of things and did not haggle unkindly. Rowland Peake spoke of the young woman who could describe a slipped slate correctly and knew what lime mortar was. Mrs. Bligh spoke, in a softer voice, of the young woman who brought chamomile in a clean jar with a paper cover tied down with string. By the 4th Sunday, when Mary walked into the parish church of Little Denby in her Sunday shawl and sat at the back on the left, 3 people nodded to her before the first hymn, and the vicar, the Reverend John Bligh, a stooped grey man of 58, said her name in the porch afterwards, as though he had known it a long time. Mary began to take in work. She mended for the vicarage, turning collars and cuffs and setting invisible patches into the knees of the vicar's second-best trousers, at 3d a garment. She kept Mrs. Fewster's shop book on Saturday evenings for a shilling and her tea, setting the week's columns straight in the neat hand Hannah had drilled into her over the kitchen table at Ash Creek. She sold small jars of chamomile and yarrow salve at the grocer's counter at 2p the jar, and Mrs. Fewster took a farthing on each and said it was fair. A rhythm formed. On Monday mornings, Mary washed at the copper and hung her linens on a line strung between the lean-to and a hazel stump. On Tuesdays, she baked 2 loaves and a plain cake, and left 1 loaf on the doorstep of an elderly widower named Absalom Reed, aged 73, a retired hedger who lived alone in a cottage half a mile down the track, and who left her, in return, a pat of butter wrapped in a dock leaf or a handful of walnuts in season. On Wednesdays, she walked into the village. On Thursdays, she mended. On Fridays, she cleaned. On Saturdays, she kept Mrs. Fewster's book. On Sundays, she went to church and sat at the back on the left, and after the service she walked home along the track past the smithy and heard Roland Peake call good afternoon to her over the wall. By the end of the summer of 1870, the people of Little Denby spoke of Hollowstone as Miss Weaver's cottage, and of Miss Weaver as a fixture of the parish, and the ejected daughter of Thomas Weaver had become, without anyone quite noting the moment, a woman of Little Denby with a trade, a fire, a door of her own, and a name spoken plainly in the porch of the parish church. On a still afternoon in early October of that year, with the hazel outside the front window turning to copper and the wind out of the ridge carrying the first coal smoke of autumn from the cottages of Little Denby, Mary Weaver sat at the dresser in the front room of Hollowstone, with the household book open before her and the low sun coming in across the flags in a long yellow slab. She had finished the week's columns in ink from a stone bottle Mrs. Fewster had ordered for her at 4p, and she had drawn a neat line under the total, and she had wiped the nib clean on a scrap of the same folded sheet from the second press that Judith had allowed her, and which had by now served as rag, curtain lining, and window cloth, and would go on serving until nothing of it was left. On the dresser beside the book lay 2 objects, set close together on the oiled wood where the light fell most clearly. The first was the small oval locket of chased silver on its plain black ribbon, opened so that the lock of soft brown hair inside it was visible against the tarnished lining. The second was the single sheet of good paper dated the 14th of June, 1841, folded once now along the crease where Mary had folded and unfolded it so many times that the paper had grown soft at the fold, and signed in a small, careful hand, Elizabeth Fenn, widow of Hollowstone Cottage, Little Denby. Mary looked at the 2 things side by side and understood, as she had come to understand slowly over the summer, that the lock of hair in the locket her mother had pressed into her 4-year-old palm on a last afternoon in the parlor at Ash Creek had been cut from the head of the woman who had also written the letter, and had also hidden the tin box behind the hearthstone, and had also, in a plain closing line, hoped that whoever found the box would sit at the fire she had sat at, and be warm. 2 women who had loved a child they had not lived to see grown had left her, between them, this cottage and this locket and this letter, and the knowledge that she had never been quite as alone as the parlor at Ash Creek had made her feel. She thought of Hannah Sowerby in a gray shawl in the yard, pressing a folded slip of paper into her hand, and she understood that Hannah had known the whole of it from the beginning, and had kept it in a widow's silence until the day it was needed. She thought of Thomas Weaver, who had let the outer will stand, and had also, before he died, permitted Hannah to keep the slip of paper with the name Hollowstone written on it, which was perhaps the only apology a long silent man had known how to make. She thought of Judith Weaver in the good chair, and of Edwin and Peter Marlowe behind her, and of the sheet from the second press folded under her arm as she left the house on a February morning, and she felt no wish to answer them. Mary Weaver had been 22 and disinherited, with £5 in a knotted handkerchief and a locket in the seam of her pocket, and she had spent that £5 on a cart and a carter and the walk to Little Denby, and it was the best £5 she ever spent. If this story sat with you, stay a moment longer, and if it moved you, take a breath before the next thing pulls at your sleeve, because the small good in it deserves that much. Whoever is watching, from whatever kitchen table or bus seat or quiet room you have carried this voice into, we are glad you are here. And if you would like more stories of women who were handed the smaller half and made a life out of it anyway, women who were counted out of a room and walked into the next room with their gloves on and their work in front of them, then subscribe and share this one with the person you first thought of when Hannah pressed the folded slip into Mary's hand. Because there is usually such a person, and they are usually waiting to be told they were seen. Leave a comment and tell us where in the world you are listening from. A village, a city, a coast, a mountain, a night shift, a hospital corridor, a long drive home, so that Mary's fire on the flags of Hollowstone can be added, in some small way, to the fire in whatever room you sit in tonight. And before you go, sit for a moment with this question, and answer it honestly to yourself and no one else. Who in your life gave you the servant's half, and called it your portion, and expected you to be grateful for it? And who, quietly and without announcement, and perhaps without your ever quite knowing, slipped a folded paper into your hand as you walked out of the yard, with an address written on it, and a key hidden under the third stone of a doorstep you had not yet seen? Because most of us have been given both, in one form or another, and the shape of a life often turns on which of the two hands we choose to remember, and which of the two we choose to walk toward. May you find, in the small keepsakes pressed into your palm by people who loved you, the address of a cottage you did not know was waiting, and may you go to it, and may you unlock the door, and may you light the fire, and may you sit at it, and may you be warm.